This video is entirely sponsored by my supporters on Patreon, more on them later. Hello there, welcome back to Beyond Ballistics. This project went a bit tits up, which is why you're seeing it here instead of the main channel, but let me start from the beginning. This is today's gun wreck. Do you recognize it? It's an Italian Carcano rifle, but not just any one. This is the original 1891 rifle version, easily distinguishable by the fact that it's much longer than any of the subsequent models. The problems here seem pretty obvious. A broken stock and lots of rust, of course. The white you see is probably construction material, suggesting this item comes from a wall cavity, a very common place for hiding weapons after World War II ended. But at this point I still couldn't imagine the disaster awaiting me. Anyway, I need to remove the stock from the metal, and the first thing to do is applying some penetrating oil. If you don't have it, you can make your own makeshift version of it by mixing regular oil with a suitable solvent like mineral spirits. This will thin it down and allow it to infiltrate crevices much better. What I'm removing here are the front barrel band and the cleaning rod. Once both barrel bands are out, it's time to undo the action screws that were really stuck in there. What I'm showing here is a trick for unscrewing particularly stuck screws without the risk of stripping the head. The vise is regulated so that the inset has nowhere to go and a spanner is used to turn it. You can only do a fraction of a turn this way since there's no room for the screw to move back, but that's usually enough to break the oxide resistance. As you can see, the stock is in such a poor condition that the screw guides came out of it. Those two tubes around the action screws were supposed to remain in the stock at all times. Now, the stock is essentially scrap. With or without the S, if you know what I mean. Actually, should I rebrand my main channel as Scrapyard Ballistics? That sounds more appropriate than Backyard. Let me know in the comments. Anyway, while the stock looks awful, I'm always amazed at how little damage the metal has gotten. One interesting thing to note is the large rear sight, optimistically adjustable up to 2000 meters. Realistically, you wouldn't hit the broadside of a barn even at half that distance with a rifle like this, but these unrealistic sights were quite common on turn-of-the-century weapons and came as a legacy of the volley firing techniques typical of the 18th and early 19th century. By the onset of World War I, however, they were completely obsolete. Now, a lot of the original finish is still on the gun, meaning it survived over a century, so I'll try to preserve that. I'll do the usual boiling water and see what comes out. On this gun, the effect of boiling water can be seen particularly well. Note that many of the areas that used to be orange are now black, indicating that a chemical reaction has occurred, the same we exploit in rust bluing of firearms. You can find a full tutorial over here. Unfortunately, not all forms of rust can be converted, and for the others, a lot of elbow grease is required. However, wetting the surface with water, better if hot as I'm doing here, has an incredible effect in speeding up the process. Now, this is where things started going really wrong. I'm used to barrels being clogged, but this one was feeling different. The blockage was way too stiff and needed a closer look. What you're seeing here is, without any shadow of a doubt, the worst thing that you can find when dealing with old firearms. The barrel has been welded shut to deactivate the gun. It must be a very old spec deactivation, since modern ones are essentially completely welded shut. The older ones kept a lot more moving parts, and that's what misled me, together with the poor conditions of the item. In hindsight, I should have figured it out way sooner. The blob on the bolt face is a weld, and was the first giveaway. Another thing that I should have noticed is this weld over here between the barrel and the action that's supposed to prevent a change of barrel. The barrel itself is welded shut at both ends, and this is proper steel welding, not any brazing or soldering. See, sometimes guns were crudely deactivated in a non-permanent way through the use of solder, adhesives, removing some parts like the firing pin, not to change the legal status of the item, but just to prevent accidents and misuse, especially by children, when the gun was only to be used as a display piece. In those cases, the functioning can be restored, since no permanent damage has been done to pressure-bearing parts. In this case, on the other hand, there's plenty of damage. The weld pool has become one piece with the barrel, meaning that there's no longer any bore to speak of in the sections that have been welded. Also, in the heat affected zone, the area that got really hot during welding, the metal properties have changed for the worse in somewhat unpredictable ways. This could be acceptable near the muzzle, but is definitely not near the chamber where pressure is higher. Which means that this is no longer a gun, but at best a display piece. Bringing us to a very important message that I want to convey about deactivated firearms. An old spec deactivated gun like this one can be at best a display piece, but it still has all of its internal mechanics accessible and moving, meaning it still has a story to tell. A new spec, EU compliant deactivated firearm is instead not a display piece, but a piece of scrap. Deactivating a gun to modern specs is, technically, exactly the same thing as scrapping it. All they are is an overly expensive fused blob of metal with a shape that somewhat resembles the firearm it was made from. They have practically no moving parts, and all the internals have essentially been melted into a solid block. Historical weapons, including some very rare and valuable examples, are being transformed into pieces of scrap to make extra profits on the generic market. What I'm suggesting is, do not fall for it, and don't feed this kind of depraved market. At that point, just get an inert replica. It makes more sense and actually feels like a gun more than a blob of weld does. That being said, what do we do with this rifle? I still decided to go ahead with it, knowing that it'll never fire again. So I wet scraped the magazine that had been boiled as well, and did the same thing for all the remaining metal parts. The bolt was instead placed into some citric acid solution. The bolts on these rifles were never originally blued, so I'm doing no harm with a chemical bath. Notice the fizzing as the carbonate-rich dirt gets dissolved by the acid. As a curiosity, that's how limescale removers work. After a few hours, I could finally take it apart. Again, notice that the only thing that they did to this bolt is welding shut the firing pin hole. All the remaining mechanics are intact. Well, they were before the whole thing was buried under construction material anyway. And here is the weld. Again, this must have heated the bolt head well beyond safety, and the bolt head being the single most stressed part of this design, you can see why I'm not looking forward to trying to revive this thing. In the end, I was quite surprised at how well the original finish was preserved. Keep in mind, this is the original bluing. Sometimes I add a rust bluing pass or two if too much of the original finish is missing, but this time I didn't even have to. So this is more like a conservation rather than a restoration. And what about the stock? This one is, as you can imagine, well beyond repair. I mean, I could have rebuilt the rear part and joined it with what remains of this, but it would have looked horrible and there's honestly no point. When I started this project, I had planned to source a spare stock for this one, but that was made complicated by the fact that this is the longest version of the rifle, the manufacture of which ended with World War I, and that of course was much different than the shorter, more recent versions. So we're looking at spares discontinued a century ago, and not surprisingly they are scarce and expensive. I found one, but that was more expensive than the gun is worth considering it is deactivated. So all I did was cleaning what was left of the stock, oiling it with boiled linseed oil, and this is it. I'm sorry I wasn't able to give you the "oh, it looks brand new" look, but sometimes things just don't go according to plan, and this is definitely one of those cases. Hope you still enjoyed the process. As I said at the beginning, this video was entirely made possible by my supporters on Patreon, all listed here. Thank you all for watching, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and I'll see you next time. Bye.